So thank you so much for bringing this panel together, everyone. April, I know you especially did a lot of hard work to bring all this together. So April, it'd be wonderful to have you introduce the panel and to get us rolling. Thank you so much.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you again for joining. Today we are, just my eyesight, 1 second. Today on this panel, we'll be discussing avatars, virtual harassment, and XR safety challenges in higher education. Joining today, we have Maya from the New School, as well as Ricky from University of Michigan Ann Arbor. Didier as well from Georgia Institute of Technology, Jeremy from University of Michigan Ann Arbor, Thomas from Microsoft, and as well as me, April Spate from Microsoft. I'm also the Director of Education Community Outreach with XRSI. And today our conversation will be led by Jeremy.
Great, thanks April. Welcome everyone.
You're welcome.
I appreciate seeing everyone here and participating, and glad to be here with you all in this beautiful environment. Yeah, and we go to the next slide. That would be great. Great. So what we plan to do today is have a more of a dialogue, a discussion about what are the challenges and opportunities in higher education as we begin to move into this social VR world and avatars and harassment, and what does that mean for institutions, and what does that mean for the platform companies like Microsoft? They support organizations like ourselves. So what we wanted to do was work through a scenario and then have discussion amongst the panelists about some of the challenges that pop up. So one of the scenarios that we've talked through is up here behind, and I'll read that to you because I think everybody can see it. So we have a faculty and students want to meet in a social VR environment, perhaps much like the one we're in today. So a faculty member purchases a VR headset and they're interested in using it synchronously with students in their course. Faculty has developed a virtual space on a publicly available third-party platform to run weekly classes or meetings. Students in the course were asked to create accounts to enter the virtual space outside of the campus single sign-on system. Some students used their university email, while others signed in with their private accounts. Students are asked to create and embody a human avatar and they're presented with an option to create it using a still image. Some students use their own image, while others choose celebrities, fictional characters from movies and other media. As part of the virtual session, students will review and view assignments or materials assigned by the faculty member, speak and collaborate in small groups, and move throughout the virtual space. So since you're all here, this should be very familiar to everyone here. But I wanted to get the conversation started. Maybe I'll start with Maya. Do you mind talking about how universities should allow students to have different avatars or identities?
Thank you, Jeremy. Yes, and I like starting with the scenario because this is not a fictional scenario. The scenario, when I wrote it, actually was based on my personal experience teaching the immersive storytelling class at Parsons School of Design and the New School in New York City. I teach this class with 70 students. And so over the last multiple years, we've obviously, like many other institutions across the world, have started to adopt virtual worlds, and with that, immersive worlds, and with that, avatars. And avatars have been in an interesting phenomena because we have been using, many of us have embodied avatars in games or other social environments. But when we come to virtual reality, there is something much more dramatic that happens, and that is by the nature of this medium, right? We are virtually here together as avatars. We can literally look at each other, look at each other's eyes. We're in each other's presence and co-presence. Things that we say here stay with us. We think about them. If you move closer to somebody, it feels, we feel the proximity. Saying something by voice is something that also triggers different things than just seeing text, which is majority of our time in higher education has been based on various platforms that really leverage text maybe some video conferencing. A lot of us have been on Zoom, but it's dramatically different once you're sharing a space. And so institutions have kind of jumped into, and the way this scenario kind of open up, it's oftentimes it's the faculty pioneer, or the faculty who kind of just knocks on the door on an administrator, whether in IT or in the provost office, and say, I think I have a grant. I think I may be able to bring about 25 headsets, and I'd like to try this with my class. Oh, and by the way, sometimes that message may come at the end of the semester, which is, I already did it. And so at the moment, we're kind of like trying and jumping into these in these spaces in a way that is, we want to leverage the technology. We want to leverage the platforms. We want to get our students be in their presence, especially in what we've witnessed in the last 18 months. And so this is a great opportunity. But with that, oftentimes we just walk in. And one of the most important things when I've been talking to administrators and others has been the idea of how do we actually initiate these conversations with our students, in particularly when it comes to embodying avatars. We know that each systems have different affordances. Our students have multiple identities, especially in that opportune moment when you're in college, when you're actually still growing and developing, and the kind of things you can embody. So one of the conversations that, for example, I think in our conversation actually jointly, as Jeremy, myself, and Deidre have been, and Vicky have been kind of having these conversations with our administrators, has been also that idea that oftentimes institutions jump in without having actually kind of this moment of considering the options, of considering what is the proper way to initiate that, to onboard the students, actually give them a sense of what is about to happen, and how are they going, as how is the space going to be actually leveraged, experienced. And this is very, while this may look like a natural next step, it often is, often happens post. I think that platforms like Altspace, here, and similar worlds, Spatial and Engage, giving us more and more opportunity to actually customize these avatars and present students with opportunities to be who they all want to be. With that comes a great opportunity, because in some ways, they can really represent themselves. And that's very, very important to young people. How they look is how they present themselves. What is very important. At the same time, that comes with some interesting questions. Should they be allowed to be whoever they want to be? Like in this case, in some ways, some students decided, I want to be myself. And other students took the opportunity to, I actually want to be somebody who I cannot be in the physical world, but I can, I can be that person, or that being, or even that creature in the virtual world. And so they may show up in costume, they may show up as a being, they may show up in a variety of ways. For some students, it's just being able to, just actually be a little bit more open to who they are. For others, a game of just, I want to surprise today my classmates or the faculty. I'm just going to put a show, and it's all possible, and they can walk in class that in a way that may be very offensive to their classmates. So I think it's a really interesting place where, in some respects, it poses a question: should we think about having this link up in a way and having some code of conduct? On the other hand, it gives our students such great opportunity to really be who they want to be and almost experience that, and it really voice that in a way that they can do in a virtual world much better than they can do in a in a actually desktop kind of scenario. Of course, in the physical world, they do just that. They come to class and they wear colorful identities in ways they and their classmates most appreciate. So I think that for me, in this conversation, that moment of actually having this conversation ahead of time, having a shared understanding of this is the space for the class, today is a space that it is really for learning, but maybe there's a space for actually happening for happy hour or something akin to a social. And then, and you can stimulate to, visiting a pizza place with your class be a lot more relaxed. So I think now we have to kind of think through, what is appropriate, and how do we provide for the space without opening the space to also somebody showing up with swastika or something else that could be very, very offensive to others in the class.
Thanks, Maya. That's a great perspective and kind of from the real world. Oh, April, you're back. So Didier and Ricky, maybe from an administration compliance perspective at an institution, how do you think about what a university should do in terms of requiring an official avatar or how to handle this? How do you think about it? What should we be thinking about?
I mean, Ricky and I are going to try to tag team. Ricky, do you want to start and maybe give an overview through the lens of FERPA, and maybe we can have debated a bit about avatar versus PII and identity in the context of a class?
Sure. Yeah, I think just really just to touch on what Maya was discussing, in terms of code of conduct, any policies you would have related to the avatar creation, just a good principle would just say if it's offensive in the real physical world, that sort of conduct should be prohibited, or at least in terms of a norms discussion highlighted for the students to just make sure that they're aware of that. And then when you come into the territory of official university policy around avatar creation, if they are so personalized to the point that they do represent the student, now you're considering whether the avatar is an educational record and should it be protected under FERPA. You can have any exemptions put in place by labeling certain personal information directory, as long as you're disclosing it to students, and perhaps there's some potential to at least put some avatar data information collection under those categories. But otherwise, yeah, I think the argument you made that interactions between very personalized student avatars should be treated just as interactions in a recording with actual human beings physically present in a classroom, if that's recorded, online Zoom sessions, if they're recorded. All those things create educational records that are protected under FERPA. And that's not to say you shouldn't record, that's to say you shouldn't then share outside of the educational setting of that classroom without first obtaining consent from those individual students, if you are going to be sharing those more broadly.
One of the challenges that we have, and so maybe for the audience, not everyone may be familiar with FERPA, but when you are in education, the main privacy law that we refer to is FERPA, the Family Education Right Privacy Act from 1974. And so this is where we have to look at when we start to look at any kind of privacy aspect, for protecting the student information in the context of education. And I think, one of the big debate with the avatar is that concept of identity, right? If you and I are, everyone today, we have our avatars. The question is, does the avatar represent our true identity? And an avatar, we thought anyway, to identify attached to it, a PII, is not the same thing as, you can, point at my avatar and you see now that, I'm Didier Contis. That represent two different type of informations when we look at it from an administrative point of view in our applications. An avatar itself, if I'm a robot and you're not able to attach any PII informations, might be very different that if you see my full avatar and it's anatomically close to me, and you're able to attach my my true identity, then it becomes a much different debate in terms of how much effort do we have to process that information. Do you agree, Ricky, or anything you want to add to that aspect?
Yeah, I think just the last thing to add there. So when you have assets from a third-party company like we have here to create an avatar, that may create some differences than if you had something customly created in terms of personally identifiable information. But then the student voices are considered personally identifiable when they're featured in recordings. So, even when you're using something like AltSpace VR here, and you're just picking and choosing different features and assets to create an avatar, you still have to be cautious in those settings in ensuring that you're not sharing inappropriately in recordings.
And one more aspect. So, I think depending on the context and, if you can buy what will be here, I think, the use of avatar in higher education is going to, and how we protect it is going to depend on the context. And when, a student is going to use an avatar as part of a class, we're going to have to spend a lot of, effort in protecting that avatar, especially if that avatar is going to initiate a lot of interactions, and we are going to be able to truly identify the student with the representation. But then one of the things, and collectively, and Maya, you touch on it, it is, the fact that an avatar is also a way to express oneself. And so, one of the things I like to bring when we start to layer on top of additional privacy law, like, GDPR or PIPL from China is, my avatar tends to represent me today. Now, if I was coming with my French beret and my baguette, okay, if you forget for a minute my French accent, does that mean that I'm from France initially? Or those are things that I, for some reason, have, some interest in the French cultures. So the fact that you come into a space or a classrooms with an avatar which express something doesn't mean that you are necessarily that thing, right? Maybe like a gender orientation, a sexual orientation, so on and so forth. And that's something we're struggling when we look at it from the perspective of GDPR and sensitive categories, right? To what extent are we going to have to protect, bring additional level of protections to the avatar in the context of, higher educations, because that avatar seems to represent some additional information. Vicky, do you want to add anything to that?
I think that's good in the interest of time. I will just briefly mention, in terms of student choices, students do not lose their rights to free speech entering the schoolhouse gate or in higher ed campus. And, it is something of a balancing act. You can place reasonable time, manner, restrictions on speech. And when it comes to creating avatars and policies around that, keeping that in mind and balancing that with other laws like Title VI of the Civil Rights Act and Title IX, where you do have specific peer-to-peer harassment provisions that would apply to educational settings where you do have a duty to protect students from severe pervasive harassment. It's a bit of a balancing act that's not a privacy topic. It's not related to privacy, but it's something to bring up in this conversation as well, with regard to the choice that goes into avatar creation.
And before turning back to you, Jeremy, and maybe to add, to open the conversation further, that's why, we're going to have maybe to discuss more about the need to have an official avatar and having the means, the technical control to protect that information. Back to you, Jeremy.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. That's giving good context there. So April and Thomas, from maybe just putting your Microsoft hats on for a moment here, in terms of like, how do you think about avatars from an institution or an organization? Is there some sort of policy or guidance that you're hoping or you're looking for in terms of, we know some other vendors are hoping like there's one identity, right? That each person has one identity. How does Microsoft think about that, or how do you think about it personally?
I can start and then pass over to Thomas. So I think this is more so probably personally rather than the Microsoft approach to it, but I think having one avatar is more ideal. I can say from a personal perspective, I'm one of those individuals, like Maya had mentioned, who wants their avatar that looks like them. And I'm very particular about that. I will spend a long time customizing my avatar to make sure that I am reflected appropriately. But then time to switch to another platform, that I've experienced this past year or 2 years, having done a series of different virtual events, both first party and third party. It's going through that cycle all over again, to having to recreate an avatar to more or less reflect who you are. And I will say for me, when their options are a little bit more limited, that makes it even more of a challenge. I joined one event some point last year, I think it was, and I didn't realize that there was a system update across avatar designs. And so when I came into the event, I was the default robot avatar, and I felt awkward the entire event because it was an event that I was speaking at and I didn't feel like myself. So then that pretty much impacted the way I was able to just feel comfortable in terms of presenting and speaking with people. And so there's instances like that. Another example as well, just slightly putting my foot in the diversity ring right now, which also becomes a big issue when it comes to creating avatars across platforms. A friend of mine recently, she attended an event on a different platform, but it was a VR platform similar to this. And she sent me a picture of her avatar, and I looked at her avatar and I had asked her, why is your avatar 3 shades lighter than you? And it come to find out they were limited in the different skin tone options that were available. And so pretty much she had to settle on whatever was provided. So I think when it comes to having avatars in general, yes, it's great if you're able to use one avatar across various different places, especially if you start to get more into customizing the clothing options that are available outside of these platforms, and then bringing them back into the platforms where you have avatars. But when you end up facing the challenges of having to go create a new avatar on 3 different platforms, it's from my perspective, just to be blunt, I'm Black. So it's very difficult to be able to find avatar customizations that more or less look like me. So then I end up having to go through that challenge again of trying to find one that more so reflects who I am personally. I'll turn over to Thomas.
Yeah, I think for me, I see myself as wanting to be sort of represented close to what I look like, but not necessarily exact. And I think that's kind of the benefit of an avatar system, of being able to represent yourself in a way that either is very close to what you want, or to something that you want to be, or something that kind of obfuscates a variety of characteristics of a person. And when we talk to people about the avatars they use, those are kind of the 3 buckets that we end up seeing. From an industry perspective, I think one of the things that we have to make sure that we're doing is talking to folks, whether they be in education or in other industries, on how they think about these things, and making sure that the platform allows for it. And I think as we kind of get our mindsets out of, in particular experiences, right, whether it may be the AltSpace VR platform or the many other platforms that exist that avatars are on, the more that we can think about how they can connect together, the more we will begin to understand, like, oh, we need more inclusive avatars. We need those that reflect different cultural values. But then on the same side, we need to make sure that we are telling industries such as Microsoft, and this is the kind of work that April and I do, is taking that feedback and saying, hey, product team, you may not have thought about this, but this is a very important thing. And, it's not just, hey, how many avatars can we fit in a room and those kind of things, but more about, hey, how do we interact? How do we engage? And so I would say, from an avatar perspective, we want to make sure that we allow folks to be who they want to be, but also we need to be careful about these things. And then I think also the last thing would be industry like Microsoft needs to understand these rules, right? Because we're learning from you all, what are the different rules by which you have to think of PII, identification, and things like that, and keeping students safe. And we need to make sure on our side that we are building the right tools and technologies and avatar systems that allow you to do that. And it can't be the sort of generic Silicon Valley, well, let's just build something first and let's see what happens. And then we can decide if we need to build in these controls. These are things that have to happen, I think, much earlier on in the building process and working together with education.
Oh, that's great. And well, that leads to another question I had around, like, outside of events like this, like, what are ways that organizations or institutions can work with platform vendors to ensure there's more inclusivity and diversity? Is there like an official mechanism? Is it, other meetups or their message boards? What's the best way to do that?
I would say it's all of the above. For us, because April and I are spatial advocates, we're kind of a little more of a direct conduit to those conversations and working with the product and marketing teams. Also, too, though, if there are feedback channels, right? Because in our tools and systems, we have feedback channels, and putting those things there, because the challenge that a lot of product teams have, and this is kind of with every business, there's way more work to do and more requests and features than there are people to actually implement them. And so what I've always said is you have to sort of build this groundswell where every time they turn around, all of their communication channels are saying, this is what's important, right? It's kind of like the web was with accessibility. There was a lot of people in the world who just did not think about accessibility in the web because it just, quote unquote, didn't matter. It's like, oh, it's 1% of my audience, which funny enough, it turns out that it was a much bigger audience. It was just that when people would try to go to a website without accessibility, they would just disappear and leave. So the Google Analytics showed a 1% when it probably was more like 40%. So I think that what we've just got to do is to make sure that it comes from everywhere. So when you're talking to someone, when you're in the forums, please be sure to say this is what we need, and especially if it's blocking you, because I know product teams, when they know that you're blocked. So if you say I'm from the University of X or I'm at Community College X and we can't use your tool because of this, I'm telling you, it speaks bigger volume than you might think.
That's great. That's really helpful, and we're glad to have you here and have that kind of direct channel, but also knowing about some of the other options and be able to share that widely with our community. Next question I had is more around kind of back to this. Should the institutions have an official avatar as part of the student record? Like, as a faculty, Maya, how do you think about that? And what do you think would be beneficial or disadvantageous?
Yeah, I think it's just really, just as it's been mentioned, and kind of starting with that idea that for our students, their identity is probably, one of the things that they feel very close to and very important to them. And for example, over the course of a semester, sometimes we will visit different worlds, and different worlds will have different options. And the worlds, just as April mentioned, that allow greater flexibility, particularly for style. There's one is appearance and color, but then it's that idea of style, and just students also, identity is oftentimes is intertwined with that. We have we also in education in particular, we want to be very respectful to the LGBT community, to the trans community, and it's very important that they can actually very, very much be able to express that. And it's wonderful to see some of my students who who are basically in the space where they can look like a boy, but they have nail polish, and that's part of their identity. And they can have makeup, like they have shades on their. So that's so important to them to be able to do that, to have that avatar represent that part of their identity. So in some ways, I think it's so important of who they are. It's so important of how they want to be seen and how they want to engage, and it's part of also connecting with each other, right? There's some cues with our body language, and the virtual reality and immersive worlds is so much more interesting to us and our students in this idea of embodiment, and you know, in kind of being able to be in the presence of others. So I would say that I still believe that we have to allow for that. We may have some ways of making sure that nothing is offensive, just as we have for other, but what it is for, just text or other. But in some ways, it's really, really important to students to have that flexibility. So I don't envision a world where we have all of our students wear the school t-shirts in a way, in a
Sure.
kind of uniform world, even though we may do that when we go to to a game. And there might be a moment when everybody wants to dress up in school colors, but I would say that that flexibility that both Tom and April said, it's just critical to us in the learning
Mhm.
process. If people come in and they just look like sort of very vanilla, I think that will be really not very difficult as a faculty to engage them. In some ways, it's just as much part of the learning journey. So I think it's very important to have some guiding posts, and also important as we bring students in these environments, but they understand what is an avatar, where does it reside, where else does it go, because we can't just assume that they are purely aware of what that footprint is, what that sort of avatar footprint will become. Just, in, our kind of like experience with social media, it's not been very successful, but that's to the point of like coming in, understanding, well, this is a footprint now that that you
Mhm.
are leaving behind. I do think that we still live in where, for example, in my this over the course of the semester, I have my students create 3 different accounts, including one here, and that meant that every time they went in and they customized an avatar, and it looked somewhat different, and it in terms of that kind of in terms of that connecting. So it's not easy on them, it's not easy on the faculty. So the sooner we get to a world where some of that will be transferable, I think the more it will be appreciated by the educational community.
Sure. Oh, that's great. Yeah, I agree completely in terms of like the representation and the options for the students. But like as a faculty, if somebody showed up and I show up as Jeremy today, but tomorrow I log in as, XYZ3, but I'm still Jeremy, does that cause issues for you as a faculty? Do you need to know who I
Yeah,
am?
I mean,
How does
I
it?
think we have a little bit, of a little bit of practice with that, right? So we have in the United States a lot of international students, and a lot of them have different types of names, and including students from different parts of the world and Asia, and they have oftentimes, some, not everybody, but
Sure.
just in my class, I have some students who adopt an English sort of name, and sometimes
Mm-hmm.
there is a direct sort of translation to that, and that's who they are really to us and to their friends.
Mm.
So I think also seeing, we're also allowing our students to, kind of have that in some respect. I think the what we need to navigate is how to still just be persistent, right? So that it is not XYZ7 and the next day is 9 and 11, but it is something persistent when it comes to like an educational experience. And it will be also very kind of, I think, challenging, and it is for us, because we step into these platforms, and sometimes they're adapted by the school, but sometimes they're part of a course. They're not necessarily an enterprise or institutional platform. So our students maybe here with me, space VR for class today, and then this later this evening they may be with Reggie Watts and listening to music, and they will be very. It will probably change 3 times their like avatar before they be between these two, but we will actually want to signal that to them and say this, hey, you should do that. That makes that's how it is how you should treat that. Just as if you go to a concert, you don't go to a concert the way you kind of often. I mean, but, they're young, so they do all kinds of things, and we all learn in that kind of part of our time. But for the most part, when they're like more, thoughtful about that. And I think that's to me that is something that we shouldn't just jump in. It's really important uh, to students to understand these virtual worlds in their context of this idea of our privacy, and our safety and our identity, and
Right.
how that translates in the future.
Oh, that's great. That makes good sense. Well, I want to switch a little bit to avatar ownership and kind of licensing. And April, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how you think about, maybe we're projecting a little bit into the future as like you can create your own avatar, maybe it's NFT or however it gets kind of uniquely created and can travel with us. Like, how do you think, like, let's say it's created with a university email account or somehow on university property, like what do you see as that future, or how would we want to shape it?
That's a really good question. And I will say personally, using the example that you just said with regards to university email versus something like if it's a personal, even if it was something like a work one, for example, I personally feel that those things should be separate. Just given that, for me personally, I just keep those lives separate. And with your personal sort of avatar, if you will, it's more personally, how do I say it? You lose that connection to the institution. Whereas, as an example, let's say you're in a virtual space, you are using an avatar that you've created on your own instance, there's no affiliation to the university. I like to think things from a PR marketing sort of perspective. If you go off and do something, that might be frowned upon, there's not that tie back to the university. Whereas if you did have an avatar that you use, let's say for my school, I went to SCAD, and if I go off and do something that's not very becoming, but I'm using that avatar, then that ties back to the university. So then it becomes a university problem at that point. I think that separation is key. As you start thinking about things like NFTs, for example, personally, I love the concept in the sense that it does provide folks who do create the opportunity to sell what they have in terms of, we're talking about avatars in this case, having different styles and such. But there also is that ownership, whereas you don't necessarily have to worry about someone else also owning that avatar, if you will. It's really just your own avatar. But I would just say, if we're talking about keeping things licensing wise from personal versus something that's under another entity, whether it be your company you work for, school that you attend as well. I just personally think those things should be separate. It's like in life, who I am at work is who I am during the day, whereas who I am after 5:00 p.m., I might present myself differently in the world. And that's where I feel that separation is key and is important. Hopefully that answered somewhat the question.
Yeah,
that
no,
you had.
I agree. Yeah, there's the multiple identities that we all wear in our different professional and educational life. Ricky, Didier, from a institutional or compliance standpoint, like how does that play out? Let's say somebody graduates and they've created an avatar. Can they take it with them? I mean, students own their own content they create, right? Like, how do we think about this?
I can, so just on the most recent topic around this, so there's, from a legal perspective, some reason to have separate school and personal avatars to begin with, just from perspective of whether you can discipline certain conduct if it's not having an impact back on campus and it happens away from campus, you're unlikely to be able to discipline that action. However, if it's using a school created account, that would allow some additional control on the part of the institution. And that's not to say that we should be limiting what students can do with their school created accounts, but obviously there are competing interests involved ensuring the safety of their students. That becomes much more manageable with a separate student created avatar. It also would help with, so in distance education anyways, which anytime you're physically separated instructor and student and using technology for teaching, that's considered distance education. So XR as well as online programs, you do need a means for identity verification in those settings to ensure the student who's enrolled in the course is the same student who's participating in it. And that, having a separate school institution issued account could help greatly with that, because you can integrate it to single sign-on and the environment that the institution's created for student accounts much more easily. And I can pass it over to DJ for the rest.
So yeah, and absolutely, and especially that being able to kind of verify who the student is as part of an assessment. And assessment, like you said, Ricky, is very important. Is key. The two examples you can look at it from a faculty perspective is, how would you react if you were teaching a class if tomorrow you've got all the students showing up with the same avatar, and you're not able to see who they are from an identity perspective? And part of the assessment is the interaction between the student. Layer kind of some of the scene from the Matrix with Mr. Smith. When you're a faculty, that would be an issue. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is we at Georgia Tech we referred to a student whose name is George P. Burdell. And that's actually a fictitious student that was created in 1927. So even before the digital world, right, students were able to create without any, high degree of verifications, fictitious students. So, this is something we're going to have to keep considering. Now, to go back to ownership of the student, of the avatar, I think one dimension we have not discussed is lifelong learning. And so I think students are going to have an official avatar, and that avatar may have to be registered in one or more official platforms to be used for instructions, but they're going to have to retain some kind of ownership so that they, as they leave and come back to the institution as part of lifelong learning, they can still retain that avatar. Right? You don't want to come back, after your bachelor, you don't want to come back after 5 years and attend an online master's and suddenly having to recreate an avatar from scratch because someone else created a similar avatar. And so that, we have to look at that long-term dimensions of lifelong learning. Another aspect, I think, about the ownership of avatars is really to what extent are we going to have students being able to bring in avatar that they are already created from other platforms. For example, when a student is going to come at university, they may have already have this avatar digital life from a K-12 or as part of dual enrollment degree. Are we going to enable them to re-import that avatar if it's highly customized, or are they going to have to be forced to recreate an avatar from scratch with the platform or the tools we provide them? So that's, I think, some of the open question. Jeremy, I don't know if I necessarily fully answered with Ricky your questions, but maybe you can follow up on that.
Yeah, no, I think those were good considerations, and like from the institution's perspective, like how, the identity verification is, especially as we go more to hybrid and remote, and like how do you know who the person is that's accessing is critical. Again, related to that, it gets me thinking, like we're starting to see more of these, students that have huge Instagram followings, or famous athletics, name and image and likeness. Like, I could imagine a space where that's now like you've created an avatar, you've created clothing or something you can sell, or like there's a value to that, value to your network. Yeah, I anticipate that. I mean, Thomas, how do you think about that from your perspective or from a platform perspective? Like, what I don't want people leaving, but like the interoperability or kind of the social networking component of it.
Yeah, the challenge isn't always in sort of the defaults. The challenge is always in the exceptional cases, right? So one of the tests that I have kind of done with my friends is what I call the Ariana Grande test, which is, what if Ariana Grande decides to want to go for a degree and comes to your class, and folks know that that is actually Ariana Grande. All of a sudden, you have a lot of challenges that you didn't think of before. One is, how do you make sure that this person isn't getting inundated with friend requests? Also, two, that the educator still has kind of control over the group, so that folks don't just kind of run away and get into a clique around Ariana Grande, and you're not being able to teach the other folks. So a lot of times that's what we try to do in our thinking around, like, okay, what are these exceptional cases that usually don't turn out to be exceptional? They're just exceptional because we hit them and then we go, wow, we don't really know what to do in this particular space. And so I think when it comes to identity and things like that, we're still going to struggle a bit, because we do have already real world things that provide that, right? So for example, most people have wallets, right? Or something that they keep things of identity on them. So I think we will come to a point, and I was talking with some friends about this, where there will be a digital wallet that will be assigned to you just like an avatar, and that digital wallet will go in different places. And it may become something else. We're always skeuomorphic when we go into from a design perspective, when we go to a different kind of platform or a different kind of communication mechanism. But we will have some kind of digital wallet that will allow us to say, yes, this is this person. And it might be voice enabled, right? Where, hey, because I immediately imagine, okay, what if someone just gets their friend as an avatar to go take the class, right? Or someone, says, hey, I'm just going to pay this random person to sit in class, for me.
Sure.
That's where we may
AI.
need exactly. So that's where we may need a bit more of those things, where we say, okay, yeah, here is my, my card, my university card, but there are some tools that are built in to make sure that, okay, we're talking to the right person, and that maybe we do some kind of two-factor authentication. And there will be those systems that we will just have to build in, but also too, we're going to mess up sometimes. I think that that's the thing that I think sometimes when we're talking about these things, we're kind of like, hey, we've screwed up in the past, right? Whether it may be web or mobile, and now we're going to have utopia. And I find that the same problems that existed in other things come to bite you again. The new world. It's just that we're now being more thoughtful about that.
Yeah, that's great. No, I agree. Well, I wanted to switch to a new topic, but any other last comments on kind of avatars and ownership and creation anyone wants to add?
I think we have a question. Yeah.
Yes. Is there a question in the
I
audience?
think we had the question.
No, it was just, okay.
Okay.
Just stretching. Okay. You need to do that in VR. All right. Well, I want to switch the topic now to discuss kind of social harassment in VR, how institutions should handle that, how do they work with the platform vendors to come up with tools. I see Altspace has some of the bubbles and some other tools to mute people, but Maya, you may have had the most experience with this and in some of your courses. Do you mind sharing a little bit what your thoughts are on this and how we should and to help shape things?
Yeah, I mean, and I think even today, like most of the times when we jump into virtual reality platforms, we're looking for a world which can be private. A big consideration is to have a private, right? And some of us who've been long enough, when I have to do it, like just jumping into any space or any platform, it certainly was, really problematic to ensure a quiet space without intruders and people running into students or running into this. But I have lived in that world, and it's very, very distracting. It's also like does not ensure the safety and privacy that students are used to in a learning environment. We have provide that when they step into a classroom or when they step into even on our campus, or even when we, for the most part, we have kind of that privacy in our majority of our system up to date. We have walled gardens, right? We call them walled gardens for a reason, whether it's a LMS or a video conferencing system, or even other applications, which any part of the tech ecosystem. We often try to have a secure space where it so that everybody who's participating in the sort of learning environment and that it's there for that reason can feel comfortable and at ease and can participate. And I think that's something that will be really interesting to look at, and to that point of actually lifelong learning, or the idea that we don't see our students as just coming to us anymore for years and staying with us for 4 years. We want them to come back, right? And that means some ways these alumni can be welcome, and they're most often that's actually a great opportunity to welcome many of our institutions alumni that leave town, that leave country, and now we have an absolutely amazing opportunity to keep connected to these places. So I think it's really going to be interesting how we enable that um, to happen between is it possible to really kind of separate and have a school only and a life only others. I do tend to think that there will be some kind of ways where we can have our identities go through different modes, and that's one way that it is our true identity is a wallet proof in some respects. It transfers over platforms, and it's who we are, and we could still have different haircuts and different and even experiment. And sometimes I think it's good to like this opportunity to actually role play in virtual worlds. It's amazing, right, from a learning perspective, because you don't need costumes. You have the affordances. When it comes to harassment, it's really interesting. Last semester, we ran a virtual conference. It was just between our students and students from master students from across different institutions. Most of them actually U.S. institutions. Most of them were invited to the virtual space. They were onboarded. We did everything. We thought we did everything, like like to prepare. And then day of event, uh, we had something happen. There was a running avatar. Um, the none of the information for participating in the virtual event was shared on social media. It was something that was shared with people who only registered and attending. They were asked to not share on social media. Yet we had this. We never could determine whether this was one of ours, whether this was a registered student at part of the conference, whether this was somebody using somebody's headset who probably was sitting in a dorm room or in a home, younger brother, older brother, sister. We never could determine that, right? Because the avatar completely protected them. We couldn't identify that identity. They did not have, obviously, they did not have, they did not customize that avatar or like, put a name on it. And so that person ran, and we took some precaution. It took him out. Like it looked like a male character, so, but it could have been they, could have, could have been anybody behind. And we just did not have the option even to we can at the moment determine that. But yes, I think there's definitely that moment that we are trying to create. We stepping in on platforms. We like to think they're secure, and sometimes it's kind of beyond our control. There's just too many variables at the moment. Open up to for entry point, even in places like this. I think harassment is real. I also have another conversation with students, and over the years. I've oftentimes collaborated with male partners in that is, teaching or work on others, sharing headsets. And here I am. Oftentimes, I have a female, character avatar that is kind of visibly, signaling that. But sometimes we share headsets, and I've had colleagues, male colleagues, jump into my headset and come back in an hour and say, "I have never thought this is happening. It's never happened to me. Nobody has come that close. Nobody has tried to touch me, kiss me, come near my space, talk to me in user language." So this is very real. It also, sadly, the research and everything shows that people, the same populations in groups that are oftentimes targeted in real life, which is minorities, people with heavy accents, people with things that signaling certain actually features, whether it's ethnic or cultural or gender, tend to basically be face the same, if not more, harassment in virtual reality. So the bubble in Outspace VR has been a great way, and I've been since the early days of Outspace here. So it's been a great way to kind of like actually demonstrate one way how this could be done. But it is very real. It also, the better headset, the better spaces, the better environment, the more these interactions feel very, very real. And I remember I was just having a conversation about that with students and a colleague like 4 years ago, and we taught some, we used certain experiences, and some of you familiar with maker, with Nona Della Pena, and she's advocate. She's done a lot of amazing experiences in VR on gender, on sort of women's and others. And the more actually, the better the headset has become, the more the students have started to come back, and suggesting to us that they've experienced them differently. And I think something to really be thinking about as we are on that sort of acceleration path, the more virtual world, the avatars are getting more real. And so as a result, things that actually perhaps something that felt like, oh, this just happened in the game, although it's never just happened in the game. We carry that, we remember that, as Jeremy Basin said. The VR experience starts when you actually take off the headset, because you've just created a memory that sticks with you. Harassment, it's real, and I think that it's something that we know how it exists in the world. We are yet to translate that, and not only translate, but to actually be able to successfully navigate in virtual worlds.
Yeah, that's fascinating. The story and the experience and kind of the unintended empathy and kind of seeing a different way, right? Unfortunately, it had to be that way, but yeah, that was a great illustration of that. April, in your role, in your advocacy role, and in your role in these platforms, how do you think about this area, or how have you experienced it?
Yeah, so I'll share two personal accounts, but then more or less what I feel to be really helpful in this space. So my very first time in VR was actually here in Altspace VR, coincidentally, about, I don't know, 2 years ago or so. And I'm one of those people that's an ambivert. Sometimes I like being social. Sometimes I prefer to be by myself, no one else around. And so coming into this virtual space for the first time while in my headset, I didn't know other people were going to be there. I thought it was just going to be me. And a guy walks up to me and he starts talking, and like I completely shut down. Not that he said anything bad, but it just caught me off guard because I didn't know that other people would be there. So I just immediately took off the headset. So situations like those, where more or less kind of thrown into a social situation and you don't really want to be social, it does become a bit more awkward, I would say. That wasn't a bad situation. That was more neutral. Now, where we did have a bad situation was not too long ago, where we did have a public event that was very much tailored to a hackathon that we were hosting internally, but it was open for the community to come and take part. And when events are more public in that sense, it can be a little difficult to discern who's there truly for the event or who's just there to troll people that are there, who's there just to cause havoc and such. When we were able to host such events in person, you more or less had an idea that whoever's there in person that's attending, they're there because they want to be there. They're there because they're interested. But when you have these virtual events, what sometimes happens is that someone will be scrolling through the events that's available, let's say here on AltSpace VR, and they hop into an event. And they may sit around for a little bit and not say much, but then out of nowhere, they turn, they start going around harassing people. And that's what we ran into recently. Whereas this one guy, sorry, it's another guy, but this one guy, he joined in the event. And he was initially asking questions that were relevant to the hackathon that we were hosting. So everything seemed normal. And then as a little bit more time went by, it was very obvious that that person was not actually there for the event. They had no clue what the event was actually about. The questions they were asking were pretty much feeding off just things they were hearing in conversation. And it got to the point where this individual was going around pretending to rob people in the space. They were going up and trying to like stick them up and say, give me your money, for example. And it got to the point where one of the attendees for the event came moderator
Did we lose? Oh, I think we
April
lost
appears to be
it.
having some internet connection issues. She actually messaged me in the background. So she
Okay,
said if she gets
okay.
disconnected, she'll come right back. So we do apologize about that.
Okay, great.
Mid-thought, but maybe Jeremy, you can pick it up.
Yeah. No, that's. I've been in a couple of events like this, where we've had people start slowly escalating or slowly starting out and then begin escalating, and then we've had to use some of the moderator tools to boot people out. Thomas, were you a part of that event, or were you part of that? Do you know any more of that story? Where that was
I wasn't a part of that event, but what I found were events and worlds that deal with this in a good way are where
Sorry, I'm back. Yeah, do you want to finish, Thomas? Do you want me to finish my story?
No,
Oh,
go ahead
okay.
and finish your story.
All right. So, so essentially, someone attending, they approached us, those of us who had moderator controls, and they told us like, "Hey, this guy is over here harassing us." And in that instance, I felt really happy for the fact that we had the ability to kick people out of the event. And it's great that those sort of features exist, because instead of awkwardly just continuing to watch this person going around bothering people, you do have that option to get them to I guess pretty much kick them out the event. Where we then have trouble, however, is the fact that they can create a new account and come on back in as someone else. And that's a challenge. That's not something necessarily that I've at least haven't come across a solution for. And so as it relates to doing these sort of public events, that's where things can get a little more scary, knowing that people can continue to come into spaces, even being able to virtually kick them out, as opposed to events that were traditionally more so held in person. Whereas if someone was harassing others, you can pretty much have them escorted out of the venue, and more or less they're not going to come back in. But with VR, it can definitely be more challenging. And I would just hope that one day there's a way to help resolve that particular issue. But I do think that in general, these sort of different moderator and host tools can be very helpful. Even the tools that we have here, like having the bubble, for instance, is really helpful. I've been to events where someone has stood directly on my avatar, and it's the most awkward feeling to know that someone's right there occupying your space, like in your body. And, sometimes it's unintentional, but to what Maya said earlier, just that treatment of folks coming up to you and trying to virtually touch you, for example, and do other, other different interactions with you that you don't want. That's when it can become even more of a challenge too, because if you are, let's say in higher ed, I'm always curious to know how professors and faculty handle this. If I come to someone and say, hey, you know, X person in the classroom, they touched me inappropriately, even though it was virtually, what exactly happens? Is there any sort of disciplinary action that occurs, or what can we do in those examples?
That's a great example. Didier, Ricky, like in terms of existing policy or procedures, like how much of that can transfer over to the space, or how much is new that we have to begin to create and train
Yeah.
people on?
Under Title IX, it's applied to each institution of higher ed. All faculty members, as they interact with students, are going to be considered mandatory reporters. So if they do have a student approach them and have a detail of harassment that does need to be reported, then there's due process protections that are outlined through institutional policies for the student who allegedly had committed the harassment, but typically there's an administrative process that's going to be gone through. There's going to be resources that are available to the victim in the case, and may result in extreme penalties that exist at the institution, such as a suspension, expulsion, depending on the results of those administrative hearings, and they could even escalate into criminal charges as well. So it's a serious offense that faculty members do have to. Now, I would say in XR, if the same thing happens, I would say follow the same procedures. If the student generally approaches you and is claiming that somebody has harassed them, that could be a Title IX offense. And if the institution's not following up on those, the institution can face consequences for that as well.
But then, I think, one of the challenge is, how do you support basically the due process, right? I mean, in the physical space, when there is an harassment, as part of the due process, there will be basically request for witnesses, an investigation, right? Not a criminal investigation, but some kind of investigation as part of the due process that every student is due, both the RSO and the RC. But then, what tools are we going to need for platforms like that, right? This social VR platform, so that you support that due process, and so I think the struggles that we may have to see is whether or not, we have to make sure that we can tie basically the avatar to the real identity, so you can support that due process. Then should there be additional features offered for more enterprise or education-oriented platforms, so that someone can record or not record, or how is that going to be distributed? Ricky, can you maybe elaborate more from your perspective, or because this is not my area of expertise, around the burden of proof, or what evidence might have to be collected to support due process in an institutional setting?
Yeah, I should say it's not my area of expertise either, but from what I do know, due process considerations, it does vary based on the type of offense. If it is considered under the policy to be sexual harassment versus sexual violence, and if there's if it's verbal or physical in nature, and in the XR environment, it is possible that would be subject to interpretation to a degree as well. But generally speaking, due process rights that have to be afforded in an administrative hearing that could result in suspension or expulsion of the student are currently entitled. And Title IX policies do vary when as each administration comes in. So under the Trump administration, they look a little different than they do under the Biden administration. These things do change, but currently you are entitled to cross-examination, and you are entitled to have an attorney present if you desire, as well as have any witnesses and evidence that could be exculpatory in nature. And there's a panel that would generally ask a lot of questions to engage in fact finding. similar, and you don't get a jury trial. It's an administrative hearing, but they can make certain factual determination based on questions submitted in writing or during the hearing themselves. So you basically have rights to cross-examination and having an attorney present as the main two. But those may not exist if the disciplinary action is far less severe than suspension or expulsion, which it may be depending on the level of the infraction.
But that's an interesting, I think aspect, right? Which is, harassment is real, and it's a problem. But then, what are the consequences faced, and how does that also impact basically being able to support basically the claim? In a purely digital world, you can be exposed, but an harassment in a VR world can have basically consequences potentially, right? We can imagine that in the physical world. You can see that the misbehavior and harassment in the digital world will lead in the futures to a dismissal from an actual institution. So that's going to, I think, raise a lot of questions about how do we basically reconciliate basically the challenge with also how do we address it when it happens and what tools do we need.
That makes great sense. Well, Thomas, maybe one comment of where you see the platforms going. What are some of the tools you're thinking about? What the evolution of how more people are using it? Some of these things come up that you hadn't thought of before. Are you thinking about these sort of recordings or the digital evidence trail, or how things could be set up to support that investigation or that exploration?
Yeah. Some of it comes from, again, kind of looking at the real world, which is a really great proxy for what we want to do and accomplish in this virtual world. One is having the artifacts visible that will tell people that bad behavior will not be tolerated. So code of conduct being front and center, talking about code of conduct being front and center. The other thing is making sure that you have community monitors that will be very visible. So maybe they have a particular look to themselves, as well as having the ability to do some pretty hard banning as when the times are needed, especially for someone who isn't being sort of below the radar in their harassment, but are just being very obvious. But then at the same time, it was funny because April and I were just talking about this, which is how could you forensically replay something so that when something does happen, how do you take all of that data and store it? Because then we were into more of an operations thing, and that's a lot of money, right? I was just thinking through what it would take to recreate from when April and I walked into this room before everybody else to when we shut this down, right? And all the kind of metadata that would need to be associated with that. So I think that I think want to get to sort of a sci-fi version of where we can go back, right? And we can look and go, hey, I want to experience this, but maybe from different vectors, or maybe I want to kind of replay this, but being able not just to kind of replay from one view, but any view that we can. So I think you'll see more of that happen. The hard part is that these are not very easy to do, right? Just even getting more than 50 people in a virtual room is a real computer science problem that we're still trying to figure out and deal with it. And so my hope is that we are, platforms or events like this will really help to kind of get that message out there that, hey, we got to fix some things first. We got to figure out some things first. And I think that like all the metaverse talk is wonderful, and it gets us kind of rallying around this kind of concept that we all have in our heads. But at the end of the day, we still have to do a lot of work beforehand. So kind of this digital forensics, I think, is something that we're going to have to figure out sooner than later, because these things that we're putting on our head, they are affecting brain chemistry. So we can't just say, well, you're in this kind of play thing, so why do you feel harassed? It's like, no, if you've been harassed, which I've been harassed as well, in one of the, not here in Altspace VR, but in one of the other platforms. And I was harassed, and I tell you, I felt it. Like I was surprised by that, because I thought, oh, well, I present as myself, and I can handle it. And the harassment, yeah, it affected me, and I've to this day, I can think about it and remember exactly what happened and exactly how I felt. And we have to remember that these machines are very different than the laptops in front of us, because these are machines that affect that brain chemistry. So when someone is attacked, when someone is harassed, it feels like the real world.
100% agree. Yeah, you feel it in a deeper way than a screen. Well, I know we've only got about 5 or 6 minutes left. Maybe we could take a question or two, or do we want to have any last comments from the panel here? Any last thoughts or comments as we go forward?
Maybe I'll just add one thing, just to build on what Thomas and others have said around harassment, is that we've been talking a lot about the issue of harassment, but in the context of a synchronous event, right? Like the scenarios that you've introduced, Jeremy, based on Maya's experience, was asynchronous interactions where one would imagine the faculty or the teaching assistants will be present. But a lot of the challenges, including harassment, can take place in an asynchronous. So, one of the value of the technology is to support asynchronous instructions, where you may have basically this space, and there will be your lectures, but then there will be other activities during the week that students will be able to jump in and collaborate as a group. What happens when that harassment takes place during this asynchronous time where the faculty is not present? Think about like a virtual design studio where a group is going to meet synchronously or asynchronously without basically any kind of faculty presence. What additional tools we're going to need for the reporting perspective, knowing the computer science challenges that Thomas basically just presented, because now you extend the problem not to an hour and a half, 2 hours, but to 24/7, right? So
sure, yeah, when no one's watching, quote. Thank you. Maya, April, Ricky, any other comments?
I just want to say, I think Thomas, the last thing he said summed up my thoughts that I have right now with regards to metaverse, is that there's still a long way to go before we get to a point where everyone more or less feels included and they feel safe and they feel as though they're protected. And my greatest hope is that, folks are doing the work to help create that space, rather than just quickly go create this platform, create this app, do this and do that. There's just a lot of work that needs to be completed. There's a good amount, and that's going to take time. Even like today, if you hop out of VR, we still have social media that's a mess, and not all that's been resolved for. And so I kind of get this like sense of, now I know we're on metaverse, but I kind of get this sense that in some ways there's some individuals who feel as though metaverse will more or less resolve the ability to interact and socialize. But I feel like it just adds now another level of complexity that we need to actively prepare for and implement solutions to mitigate those negative situations that we may potentially run into. So that's my final thought.
Couldn't agree more. Thank you. Maya, did you want to?
Yeah, I actually want to throw this back to the Access Safety Initiative and this week, because I think it's so important to have this conversation, because so often we focus on the technology, and we kind of introduce our students as, you're going to be wearing a headset, and this is how the headset works, and how the world works, and so much emphasis is basically given on that sort of platform and technology, and what happens inside becomes like just something that it's assumed. that somehow our students know how to be there, just because they're young, just because they played games, just because, you know, it seems like they may be native. That is often not the case. And I think this is so important to have these conversations, in addition to we're going to be actually meeting in a virtual world, which oftentimes energizes students, but also being able to, you know, include these topics and be very proactive in bringing these conversations. And, you know, in having a conversations with colleagues and other people on campuses, and people who are interested in, you know, interacting with young people in particular in these virtual worlds, just about everybody, because it's a new world, it's a new place, it changes and evolves every day. And so it's so important to have this week, the XR Safety Week, and this initiative. And so I'm grateful to have had this conversation with all of you today.
Thank
Hey,
you.
Jeremy, I had one more thing, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Of course.
The last thing I just want to say, in addition to what Maya said, is a lot of this starts in the classroom. A lot of this starts in the documentation that different platforms are building to teach people how to use their products, their tools and services. A big part of what we do in my team in advocacy is that we're out there to also help educate developers that are beginners, those that are more intermediate and advanced, but especially those beginners, that's that group that more or less has that opportunity to still be molded, if you will, as they are starting out on their dev journey. That is the opportunity to start introducing ethics and privacy and safety as they're developing. Because if what I more or less see spending time in the community is there's a lot of tutorials on how to do this thing, but what's missing is that ethical component. And I think the more that that's being at the forefront as we're onboarding new devs to start creating for extended reality, that can make a really big difference. And so if anyone out there has also been educated, that is the
We lost her again. I exactly agree. I mean, that's one of the main reasons the University of Michigan we're involved in the XR Safety Initiative and wanting to help influence early and as we go down this journey. And so it's really important for us to be part of the conversation, understanding more, help shaping the next generation. So I know we're at time. Any last comments, Thomas, Ricky? Okay, well, thank you. Oh, yeah.
That's about it.
Well, thank you all so much. We appreciate. Sorry you got cut off again, April. We're just wrapping up here, but thank you all. Really appreciate it. Feel free to reach out to us if you have other questions.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. We're on a break for about 2 hours until our next talk.